Hey all, and welcome to today's panel, Using History to Create Fantasy. I was reading this article the other day on J.R.R. Tolkien and how he used all of British history to write the Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings stories. So fascinating, so in-depth. A lot of the characters that he named actually have names that are similar, but for someone who's not a history buff, it just went over my head. So it was a really interesting topic. I thought we'd discuss it. I've got some of my author friends here. Hey, Spencer, welcome.
Hey.
Why don't you start off by introducing yourself?
I'm Spencer Ellsworth. I've written a whole lot of fantasy and science fiction, usually pulling from history, and I've got a space opera trilogy coming out from Tor this year.
Congrats.
That's awesome.
That's awesome.
Well done, Agnes.
Okay, so I'm Agnes. I'm the author of the Q16 series, and I write primarily Portal Fantasy, but I use a lot of history to kind of draw reference for various races and even just actual events that happen within what I write.
Awesome. Angie.
Hello, I'm Angie. I write sort of dystopian, fantasy, medieval, historical stuff. Have one book out right now. I'm working on the second one. And yeah, that's about it.
Michael.
Hey, I write fantasy mainly. I actually will be having the first of my Counterbalance trilogy out in this year. Hopefully it should be around April, May time. It is epic fantasy, so should hopefully be fun. Most of my fantasy is built in my own world, and I use history. I use the military culture of ancient history an awful lot in my writing, so it should hopefully be good for me.
Michelle.
Awesome. I write a bit of everything. I write some contemporary romance, some urban fantasy. I've got some fantasy in the work, which is a bit more, I guess, epic fantasy, high-level fantasy, alternate steampunky fairy tale kind of things. So a bit of everything, and I like to draw very heavily on history and stuff for the urban fantasy because I like to ground it in, you know, the world that we live in today.
Very cool. And Katerina.
Hi, I'm Katerina Pride. I write a little bit. I'm actually working on a historical fantasy series, but I'm also a publisher for the magazine Worlds of Wonder, and I actually used to work at a law office that specialized in entertainment law, and we dealt with things like libel and defamation suits.
All right, so let's start off with anyone. How do you use history to guide your stories? How much history, what elements of history do you pull to write your stories?
You know, I think most of us, even if we're not thinking about it, use history for the basis of a lot of what we're writing. Because if nothing else, we dive into basic medieval settings or modern settings, all of which, while it isn't spoken aloud, are based on the same rules and behavior that we're familiar with in that Middle European growing into our current modern culture.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree with that. I've got an organisation in mind that I sort of introduced as coming from Noah, and it's based on the biblical sort of legends of it, and then it's come through since then. And basically every event in history can be explained away by this group's involvement in it, because they're trying to rid the world of the paranormal creatures.
Is it like the Illuminati period?
Yeah, kind of.
We have.
I thought it was. Oh, go ahead. Never mind.
You go. You go. It's fine.
I was just saying, I thought what Andy brought up about the Tolkien stuff was very interesting. I don't know if you read the recent publication that came out with the parts of a story that he wanted to tell. It was very directly based on historical Norwegian folktale and their gods and stuff. And I read the thing. It was fascinating. It was filled with all of this background information on the historical folk tales that he'd used and how he changed the names from the original gods and then couldn't make up his mind and changed the names again So it was a little tricky reading because you'd read the first half, and then in the next chapter, the names of the main characters changed, and you had to just go with it and go, okay, these are still the same main characters, and continue. Not to mention the fact that, like so many of our historical god setups, there's lots of incest and other things that make us just squirm.
Yeah, definitely, especially with the Greeks.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a sort of an urban fantasy romance mythology series with the Greek gods, and they are some messed up people.
Oh yeah,
It's
The
pretty
best.
good.
Definitely.
For me, history, I've taken a lot of the military side. I'm fascinated by military history. So, I mean, when Counterbalance comes out, when people read up, there's one of the major empires it is like a sort of like a medieval fantasy setting, but the main professional army is heavily built off Rome. Because I'm sort of like trying to blend I'm trying to get as many cultures. I think it's important that people do read up on it. Like, look at all
Romans.
there's just vast numbers of like military tactics that have been used across history. There is the Macedonian phalanx, Greek infantry warfare.
Interesting.
Then we can go even further back and look into how important the spear was in military warfare. Then we have the importance of cavalry in military warfare, because then we have the invention of the stirrup, which makes cavalry even more important. And if you research it all, it becomes very interesting for me.
It gives you a lot of lessons into the future too, I guess. You know, I know that it's advanced a bit more in everything, but you can learn so much from it.
I think you can take virtually any historical event and use it in a novel, to be honest. I mean, look at Game of Thrones. I mean, George R. R. Martin built around Westeros based on the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other influences in there as well,
yeah.
Greek and Roman history and all that sort of stuff. You can almost pluck the character out of the history and put it straight into his books, which is great that he could combine them all in such a cohesive sort of way.
Very much so.
but I think you also hit upon a really important point, is in our modern view, we have very little understanding of how amazingly dangerous and difficult some of these things can be. So you talked about the phalanx, and I'm a big Alexander fan and all.
Very bloody.
Yeah, the Swiss army still practices with their own version of pole arms. And people go, why do they do that? It's really silly. Because a group of them in a square walking at you with those pole arms, they'll kill you really easily. And we don't get it. We don't realize it. We don't have a modern version.
I mean, they used the phalanx in military warfare up until the 1700s. If you look back, I mean, people would be even using slings during the Spanish Civil War for hand grenades. So even an ancient weapon can still be very effective in the modern setting. It just depends on how you use it.
It's a great place to take and start doing extrapolation to be able to come up with something in the future that's very effective. You've got the information on the tactics, and what if pole arms were lasers or something, or phasers or Jedi light swords, whatever, but put it in some way, it'd be really, really dangerous and scary to walk into something like that.
I mean, it also gives you a grounding for dystopians and stuff like that. Like if you imagine that every single instrument of war that we've got these days was ineffective for some reason, what would we have to go back to? And we'd have to go back to those historical weapons.
The Walking Dead handles that pretty well from what I've seen. I haven't seen a lot of it, but yeah, they do a fair bit.
Yeah, because guns are ruled out in that world because it'll attract the zombies rather than,
exactly.
Like
Walking Dead's very interesting because, I think zombie sort of culture is built around psychological warfare.
Yeah,
because
the humans are always the worst enemy.
Well, not just that, because a lot of the time in military tactics, sometimes it's not just about how many weapons I have, or if I outnumber you 10 to 1, it's how well can you break an enemy. And that's what military tactics were. The art of war is how you can shatter your enemy's morale. Zombies don't feel that. So, I mean, if we want to look into the Walking Dead and zombie culture, you can't shock an awe undead, and that's a huge advantage for them. if you're writing that kind of fantasy. So 10 undead can destroy 100 humans if they're well armed just through psychological warfare.
Probably one of the most interesting cultures to draw on for that sort of like tactics and stuff is the Chinese. I mean, you hear some of these crazy stories, like one Chinese general, he had 100 men to defend a city against 10,000 or some ridiculous number. And he puts all his men in buildings and he sits on the gate and he starts playing a harp. And the enemy's advancing and they see this guy and they're like, no, this is a trap. This is going to be something weird. So they retreat. Like just the craziest things, the Chinese warfare, the generals, all of that stuff. Probably a lot.
Chinese, yeah. I don't know much about Chinese military history, but they were impressive. Like the Chinese rockets, I mean, they invented rockets way before anybody else. And it's very likely that even the Romans actually saw China at some point in their lives, because 20,000 of them were taken prisoner by Partha out of Carrhae, and they got taken to the far reaches of the Parthian Empire, which was taken over by China. So once you research that, it's fascinating to see how cultures will mingle with each other.
Interesting.
It would certainly be interesting to be writing in an alternate history or an alternate world about how they went through inventing the rocket. Roger Zelazny actually had a real good section in one of his books. I don't know if you remember that in the Chronicles of Amber, guns don't work in Amber. That's why everybody fought by sword and dagger so much. But he figured out that there was a jeweler's polish in one of the alternate universes that would actually ignite and act like gunpowder in amber. And so he reinvented guns and rockets and other weaponry using this jeweler's polish for gunpowder.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's one of the fun things. I love when someone there seems to be a sort of a divide between fantasies where people actually account for how much magic would change history, and fantasies where they just kind of dump the magic into history. Like I love the His Majesty's Dragon books, but history wouldn't develop the same way if we actually we're living cheek by jowl with dragons. I'm trying to do something with this where I've got sort of like a brick book I keep coming back to and rewriting and throwing out parts. I was trying to come up with magic that would support an empire in the way that, fossil fuels and all the other fossil fuels and have supported empire in the 19th century. But it ends up kind of you end up kind of writing an encyclopedia if you get too detailed.
And that's something that they warn you about not doing. Don't put too much in.
You need to know it all, and then you need to leave it all out.
Yeah. Though I got into I think all of us have been in the world building trap. If you spend years building your world and building history, you're never going to write the story. So.
And Tolkien did exactly that. There's 9, 12 books on his world building out there that his son put together. But he didn't keep writing all the short stories and the next books that were supposed to be in the cycle. We end up stopping at the Silmarillion and a few extra short stories, some of which are not completed, because he spent way too much time in his life world building, researching, gathering information.
But at the same time, he built probably one of the best fantasy worlds ever created. So
I totally agree. It's amazing, but
there is very little I've read which comes even close to depth of that. But I mean, at the same time, Tolkien was a genius. So
I agree, and I would have liked to have seen the next series that he had planned to write after the Lord of the Rings cycle. So that's a shame.
You really need to balance you need to balance world building with actually writing stories. I've learned that horrible stuff. I've learned that I've taken some very bad lessons on that, but.
I maintain one of the things that makes me stay happy is knowing somewhere out there is an alternate world where I can get the trilogy and I can get the 6 seasons of Firefly and all the rest and enjoy the entertainment.
There we go. Now let's shift the focus a little bit to more the political history. Angie, in your sewing series sort of reminded me, the book Sewing sort of reminded me of medieval Europe. Was that sort of what you were channeling, or were you going for a different, what did you have in mind when you were creating that?
I didn't really have like a certain plan. It started out more medieval than it became. And I pull a lot from Nazis, from my bad guys, which was not intentional. It just kind of happened, and I sort of realized that they were showing some characteristics of that, and I was like, well, then I'm gonna play up on this.
So you kind of leaned into that.
Yeah. Once I realized that it was kind of going that direction, it's like, well, then I have like all these Nazi books and stuff, and
Double down on it.
it's like I'm not, but yeah, just having that sort of basis, and I've pulled from like certain people in Nazi Germany that were like influential, and trying to sort of make a character that's similar-ish. I can't remember the guy's name, but there's one like really bad Nazi guy that I am using for a character inspiration.
Interesting. Agnes,
Mangala?
where did you pull your, what did you envision when you were writing your series?
For the political history side, or?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the second book in the Q16 series that I just finished writing, I pulled from Polish history. And I don't know how familiar anybody here is, not familiar. Okay, so they actually were one of the first people to have a democratic system in terms of how they would elect their kings. There was no kind of royal lineage. Yeah, your son was the prince or whatever, but every single time the king passed away, they would actually have to elect a king out of a whole bunch of candidates. So that's something that I kind of adapted for one of the races in terms of how they handle their politics. Like, yes, you have your king, but when he passes away, you have this whole election process that goes through that. And that was kind of my way of drawing from political history, because I found that very fascinating, just being different than kind of the traditional monarchy system that you always hear about.
Interesting. Very cool. Spencer, what about you? Where did you draw from, or what were you sort of channeling when you wrote yours?
Well, so my books that are coming out are a space opera. They're set 10,000 years in the future, but this is about fantasy. But it's actually they're really informed by history. I was interested in the Russian Revolution, basically every idealistic revolution gone bad. So one of the ways I explain my series is that imagine if you put all this faith in Luke Skywalker and he turned out to be worse, and he told you how, now you're part of the great state of the Jedi and everything's great, and ignore all these people who are disappearing. I tried to write that on a galactic scale. So I think that there's something to be said for how much history teaches you about human nature and how much you can extrapolate that. Really, one of the reasons we like Game of Thrones is just that it shows how people act when they get power. And I think Martin probably is pulling as much of that from modern history, just the way power affects people as he is from the medieval and ancient history that he uses.
Fingers crossed that he introduces like an orange-colored character into something, right?
Yeah.
Get to be headed very quickly.
Yeah, Michelle, what about you? Where do you pull from? What is your...
I pull from a range of different places. So my urban fantasy, like I said, it started off with the concept of them being the creators of the people who would wipe the word saying of paranormal creatures, say they were God-given their rights. So it sort of started from the biblical. There's a lot of Phoenician history, which was really, really hard to look up because it's a dead culture. It doesn't exist anymore. So trying to find, exactly where the legends come from and what gods you can use and all that sort of stuff. And then just a matter of looking at all the different types of political structures there. In the Reign, they take advantage of modern government and of how insidious you can become in it if you know what you're doing, and how like that whole thing of power and power corrupts absolutely, and all that sort of stuff comes into where they get their power from and why they make the rules they make. Like they eventually decide that all paranormal creatures are evil because it's easier and it's cheaper, and if they vilify them, people will go out and kill them without questioning whether or not it's right. And that's sort of where, come back to the Nazis and all that sort of stuff, where that sort of thing has become an issue.
Very good. Michael, what about you? Where do you pull from?
Can you guys hear me? Is mine on?
Yep.
That's quite interesting because I'm right. This is going to be awkward. The Empire in my Counterbalance series, it's only in one small continent. As I said, its political structure is sort of like a blend between.
He's keeping us all in suspense. Connection.
What?
Yeah.
Can I say
Go
something?
ahead, Katerina.
Both of you used the phrase "absolute power corrupts absolutely," but I read a number of years ago a quote, a paper on how absolute power does not corrupt. The whole idea that power corrupts, it's not the power itself that corrupts, it's the fear of losing the power that corrupts. So if you have absolute power, you're incorruptible, because what do you have to worry about?
Interesting. Very interesting.
And we forget that one all the time. We've got the God who's omniscient and everything, and then goes bad. It's like, but why? He knows everything. Nobody has the ability to threaten him. He's safe in his spot. Why would he act in a corrupt fashion? There's no real logic behind it, because everybody buys into the absolute power corrupts absolutely. And we see that trope again and again and again without there being logic behind it.
Very, very interesting. It's a good point. And that's actually one thing that history can't give us, is sort of an insight into the characters or to the people, right? Like, I've always thought, what if these people, that are revered as holy men, Buddha, Muhammad, all of that, what if they had something that made them different? Like, let's say a lot of the high-powered CEOs of modern day have sociopathic traits or psychopathic traits. So what if some of these famous people who people look up to and say, oh, he's a hero or he's an important person, they had that? And so we've bought into that delusion. Like, it's just a weird thing to think about, but it's kind of interesting.
Super charismatic, yeah.
Yeah, but you look at Gandhi, even, like, some of the stuff that he's done, it goes in the face of what we regard as right in the Western culture.
Sleeping with young women.
Exactly, but he's still held up as this, paradigm of peace and all that sort of stuff. I guess it comes back to that whole thing of history is written by the winners, and, they can paint anyone in whatever light they want. They can paint themselves in the best light possible and their enemies in the worst, and they're going to do that because that way they become more special than they were anyway.
But that is an advantage, too, of using the more recent history. You made the point earlier, Andy, about not being able to know what's in their minds, but we have so many interesting symbols out there today and interesting people, and now we're at the point where we can have biographies of these people and autobiographies. I got to tell you, one of the most fascinating books I have read in my life is Sophia Loren's autobiography. She was a young girl in Italy at the time with Mussolini and everything, and with the bombings and all. And she tells the story about it was like growing up there and everything, and it's fascinating. And you would never have associated this hard scrabble background with this beautiful, glamorous, smooth, slick woman. But she's extremely candid in her autobiography, and it gives you lots of insight into her decisions and thoughts. And that's something that's out there right now for all of us to use. Everybody famous has written an autobiography, and it can give us, at least what they're willing to tell publicly, insight into them, which brings us into the other side of using more recent history to inform things, running into problems where you're using somebody who's actually alive or who's only recently deceased, and what you're saying about them goes over into your fantasy, your imagination of the character, and then you're slipping into the world of defamation and libel, where what you're pretending that they did, where what you're pretending that they're saying is something that they take offense at. And then we run into a real risky area.
Very interesting.
Yeah. That was definitely something I had some concerns with to a certain degree, because I have Nathaniel Hawthorne as one of, I guess, a major character in the history of my world, where his father was involved in all the Salem witch trials, and that becomes, obviously, he was part of the reign, and so Nathaniel Hawthorne was then being the first to actually reject those ideals. So it's sort of bringing this major historical figure in and saying, well, he was on this side of the battle, sort of thing, which, you know, we ended up saying it's not painting him a defamation light or anything like that, so we decided to go with it. But yeah, it was something I sort of had in the back of my mind as I was writing it, going, is this really what I should be doing?
Well, we had one of our clients at the law firm I worked at that did a series that basically had a football analog that was gladiator fighting. And he brought, you know, the U.S. into mostly being the Roman Empire kind of idea. And he used Howard Cosell as a character, being famous and everything, doing the gladiator rounds. And Howard Cosell had already passed it at this point, but his family is still very much alive, and they were not at all happy with this. The portrayal wasn't horrible, I would have to say, but it was definitely rougher and more violent than anything that we ever saw in reality. And they very effectively blocked the book.
Wow. Interesting. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have today. Thank you guys so much for joining in.
Thanks, Andy.
Thanks
for having me.
having us.
Great
Thank
to
you.
have guys.
Sorry, I lost connection.
No worries. These things happen. If you want to
That
find out
happened, you're
more
the best.
about all these awesome author people, check out the comments below and take a look at them. Cheers.